Welcome to part one of understanding virtual disk options. Now there's a lot of things going on here, so I want to dedicate this two-part video to covering these things so that you can understand the implications of these choices that you make. So here in part one I want to talk about the first of the two main choices pertaining to a virtual machine's disk, and that is, the first one is location of the actual disk files for the virtual machine. Now the default choice, what probably 90% of the people out there are going to go with, if you're running this on a laptop so that you can do test environments and so forth, you're probably just going to have a virtual disk on the host system. We're basically going to kind of partition off a little section of the host system disk, and we're going to dedicate that to running the virtual files for the virtual machine. But then you also have a couple of other choices. I can use a separate physical disk for my virtual machine, or I can use a separate unused partition on a disk. And so each of these gives me particular advantages, disadvantages, but I don't want to go into those as much necessarily as some of the gotchas that you have to watch for with using these. Now the other choice that you have pertaining to your virtual machine disk is the actual structure of the main disk file, the VMDK file. You can either have one single file, one large file, which is going to be the default in the setup procedures in VMware Workstation, or you can have multiple smaller files, and we'll pay closer attention to that in part two. So first of all, let's talk about the file location options you have. You can just do a virtual disk. This is really just called a virtual disk, and what it really means is we're going to kind of fence off an area on the host operating system disk, and we're going to run our virtual machine. Now this is the default location, and for Windows XP, Windows Server 2003, you're going to find your VMDK files and all that stuff out there on the C drive in the Documents and Settings folder. Username, this is the currently logged in username, then My Documents, and then the last folder, My Virtual Machines. If you go out there and look for My Virtual Machines, boom, you will see the files for your virtual machine out there in this location. Now again, this is the default. This is where most people end up putting them. If you're running Windows Vista or Windows 7, your virtual disk files are going to be on the C drive in the users folder, the username folder, again currently logged in user, then inside there the documents folder, and inside there virtual machines. Very easy to find these things. If you're in Linux, it's going to be in the home directory. The home directory is the home directory of the currently logged in users, and then in there you're going to see a folder called VMware, and inside there will be your virtual files. So anyway, this is kind of the default setup, and this is called a virtual disk on the host. Now another option is to use a separate physical disk. There's some things you have to watch for here. Number one, this physical disk cannot contain Windows Vista or a Windows 7 system partition. It will cause problems. Also, you need to be careful. Here's one of the problems it'll cause. Any data that's already on that disk is going to be lost. So if you're going to use a disk as a separate physical disk for your virtual machine, make sure you back up any data on it before you point your virtual machine at it. Also, it cannot be a Windows XP or a Server dynamic disk. Now in these operating systems, Microsoft offered us the capability of having either a basic disk or a dynamic disk. And a dynamic disk had some fault tolerance functionalities to it, had some other things to protect when you're spreading data across volumes and all sorts of things. And so when you install these products, by default it was a basic disk. You could go in through the disk management tool, turn it into a dynamic disk, and get more functionality. However, you can't use a dynamic disk as a virtual disk using VMware Workstation. So if it is a dynamic disk and you want to use it, you're going to have to go into the disk management tool in the Windows operating system and revert this thing from a dynamic back to a basic, and when you do that, all the data is wiped off. Okay, so you can do this, but just make sure that you watch for that. All the data is going to get destroyed. That's never a good day if you weren't counting on that. On Linux host, you want to make sure that you set the device group membership or the device ownership appropriately on that physical disk so that the users on the virtual disk can actually access files on that separate physical disk. Now, a separate physical disk in certain conditions can give you better performance for all the same reasons that separate physical disks always do anyway. But again, just watch for these gotchas when you try to set that up. Now, what about an unused partition on the host system? Let's say I've got a 750 gigabyte hard drive on my host, and I've got an unused partition out there. I've got C, D, and E partitions. E hasn't been used, and I want that whole partition dedicated to my virtual machine. You can do that, but it's very, very important that you understand you first need to go into the Windows operating system, use that disk management tool, and you want to unmount the partition from the host operating system. Now, Windows people tend not to think in terms of mounting hard disks and unmounting hard disks. What this means, kind of in English, is that you need to take the drive letter away on the host system. In other words, I want to go into the disk management tool, unmount it, so that there's just an unused partition out there. There's no drive letter assigned to it or anything. In other words, the host system doesn't even recognize it, and it's not going to mess with it. If you don't do this, corruption may occur if the partition is mounted on the host operating system, and corruption is something you don't want on your disks. Your virtual machine stops working, and then that's not a good afternoon. Okay, so anyway, this is going to be the end of part one. So that's just some little issues and gotchas to watch for on your file locations on where you're sticking your virtual machine files. And in part two, we'll talk about how to configure the files themselves. So join me in part two of Understanding Virtual Disk Options.